Hi, Dr. Seth. I'm Joe.
Bernadette.
Rory.
First and foremost, we want to thank you for such a great semester. It was really a pleasure being in the class. For our final presentation, we're going to be talking about accounting procedures behind microtransactions and subscriptions within the gaming industry. So without any further ado, we'll get this started. So the first thing I do want to cover is what are microtransactions exactly? So microtransactions, or in-app purchases, as they may be referred to within mobile applications, are a business model that allows users to purchase low-cost items within video games and phone applications. If you've played any games like Candy Crush Saga or Angry Birds on your iPad or iPhone, these are the types of transactions where you can get extra lives, things like that. So these transactions can actually vary between from $1 to over $100 depending on the game that you're purchasing them in. And these microtransactions can either provide gamers with advantages over other gamers or merely be a cosmetic change to in-game items. So for games such as Fortnite, which we're going to be covering later, you can buy different skins for your character to make it look different. And these transactions have been commonplace in mobile games that are found on phones, tablets, and etc., and are becoming more popular on gaming systems such as the PlayStation and Xbox as of recent years. So just some examples that we have over here. This is the typical one that you would find on a mobile game, while this is from an online game called Overwatch, where you can buy things called loot boxes, which are essentially microtransactions that also contain, different items for the gamers. So this is just a pros and cons chart for microtransactions, just to give you an idea of what are some of the setbacks and what are some of the benefits of implementing it into your game. So to go through the pros first, it allows for consumers to experience the game without paying anything up front. So the reason behind this is because a lot of these games that have microtransactions optimize themselves through a freemium sort of business model. We're going to be covering that a little bit later in the presentation. Along with that, it allows consumers to flexibly pick what they want to purchase from the game. So let's say if a game has a freemium model, it will allow gamers to pick and choose which items they want to buy from the game. So instead of paying $60 and having all these different things within the game that you don't necessarily want, you could pay absolutely nothing and pay for the specific items or weapons that you want in your games. And of course, with any business model, there are always some setbacks. So first and foremost, the revenue from the game is going to be based solely on the interest of the consumers, especially when you're implementing something such as a freemium model. The reasoning behind this is because customers are picking and choosing exactly what they want, so you're not going to be getting that $60 up front that you get with any basic video game. And it's also much more costly to gain popularity due to the limited budgeting. And like I mentioned before, if you're basing your revenue merely on these microtransactions, you have to make sure that customers are into your product. So as I mentioned before, we're going to go a little bit more in depth about the freemium gaming model. So one of the games that I mentioned first and foremost, two of the games actually, are Candy Crush Saga and Angry Birds. This is just another example of them, Super Mario Run, which is a mobile freemium game based on the popular franchise. So to entice consumers and gamers to play, customers have implemented a freemium business structure in the respective video games. By allowing users to download and play the game for free, players are able to experience everything in the game free of charge. And to gain revenue from these games, besides the download revenue that they generate from the application stores, video game companies will allow gamers to purchase in-game products to either continue playing the game, such as extra lives, as I mentioned before, or as previously mentioned, have an advantage over the other games as well. This is just a basic diagram to give you a better understanding of what the freemium model actually entails. So for method one, we can see that the company is providing a free product to the customer at hand, and you can see that there are certain little paywalls that the consumer would have to pay back if they were to, gain those certain items. Method two is that you would provide the customers with a premium product, which is just like a basic transaction of the video game, and then the consumer would pay the entire thing back. So just to reiterate again, for method one, you can be utilizing a free product and providing it to the customer. That's the basis of the freemium. And if the customer wants these certain items, they would have to pay more. It's not visualized on this diagram, But with a visual like that, that gives you a better understanding of what it seems like in a typical setting when you're buying something for its full price. And over here, it's the premium, give it away for free, make money. Just a little diagram that I like to show off because it shows the different statistics about how premium is implemented in games. So, the successful premium game examples that I really want to touch on, just to show, I know it may seem a little bit sketchy by the way I was explaining it before, but I want to show you how beneficial such a business model can actually be. First and foremost is a game called League of Legends, which is a personal computer game. It's an online battle MMORPG, which means the massively multiplayer online role-playing game. It's like the term used within like the video industry. And there have been various microtransactions that reward gamers with in-game icons and boosts. This game has actually become so popular that it's one of the most profitable esports games that have been seen in competitions like EVO and MLG. And of course, Pokemon Go, which has been a phenomenon since it came out, I think, in 2016 or 2017. It's a mobile game that's based on a popular Japanese franchise, and some of the microtransactions that are present within the game reward gamers with more options to catch these creatures called Pokemon. And of course, we can't talk about any freemium games without talking about Fortnite, which is a cultural phenomenon that we see throughout the news today. And the microtransactions that are in the game, as I mentioned before, are merely cosmetics that the gamers can use for their avatars.
So Electronic Arts is one of the largest video game companies in the world, and we figured we'd do a little case study on it to prove to you how much digital revenues like really account for within at least Electronic Arts like revenues. So you can see that in green, that is all the extra content, which is part of their digital revenues, which has been increasing over the past few years. You can see from about 800 to almost $1,000 million. So that's about a 20% increase over the course of 3 years. And during this time period, from January 1st, 2015, the Electronic Arts stock price went from $55 to $80 in December 1st, 2016. So that just goes to show how much profitability there is in investing in digital assets. So the history of in-game purchases, pretty much we've seen traditional revenue recognition principles applied to video games, such as World of Warcraft, where it was kind of subscription-based. Companies would debit their cash and credit their sales revenue as people paid for their subscription. We're going to talk a little bit about other types of subscriptions as well. But basically, over a period of time, so a month or a year, or whatever the company determines as their subscription basis, that's the time period in which their revenues are going to be recognized. And this is kind of the key principle with microtransactions, is that there's a lot of estimations to be made as to over what time period should the revenue from these microtransactions be recognized. So current methods of recognition, first and foremost, is the life of the virtual good. So basically, some companies are recognizing the revenue over the course of the virtual good itself. So my example was buying extra lives. So say you bought extra lives in a Mario Brothers game. When you use that extra life is the life of the virtual good. So as soon as that life is used, that's when the revenue for the digital asset can be recognized. Two, the life of the gamer. So revenue can be recognized over the reasonably estimated period of time in which the player would be playing the game. So say a company determines that most players are going to be playing this game for 6 months. Their revenue from sales of those microtransactions would be recognized over that time period. And then third is the life of the game. So gaming companies would recognize revenue over the estimated life of the game itself. That's kind of probably the last resort. It's the most indeterminable because some games can be released with a lot of anticipation for them, and for whatever reason they're just not as popular, and so their estimated life early on might be a lot longer than what it actually turns out to be. So under the current guidance, this is the accounting journal entries that would be included under each of these three methods. At the point of sale, they would debit their cash and credit their unearned revenue because technically they still haven't earned their revenue from the actual service being provided. But once the service period ends, so again, the life of the good, the life of the gamer, or the life of the game itself, the debit would be to unearned revenues, and they would credit their actual revenues.
So as Rory kind of touched upon before, there's two different ways in which a company in the gaming industry can achieve revenue through games, and those ways are through microtransactions, which we've already talked a lot about, and subscriptions. And subscriptions are when the supplier makes regular charges for a product, and the difference between microtransactions and subscriptions is that the access being provided and the time frequencies over which the subscriptions are paid. And the provider may offer a premium service where players can access a certain amount of content for free or pay a subscription fee for premium content. And the provider may charge subscriptions over a different time basis, such as monthly, over 6 months, yearly, etc. And subscriptions measure their performance based on average customer lifetime value, or ACLV, and the monthly recurring revenue. ACLV is when the product of the average customer payments and the duration of the average length of time and that the consumer opts in for the customer lifetime. And MMR is the amount of revenue that is likely to be obtained each month based on customer subscription rates and behaviors, and those are usually stable throughout the subscription model. And microtransactions, on the other hand, measure their performance based on average revenue per use and average revenue per paying user. And ARPU measures the average revenue for an individual user for all the users of the service or the product. And ARPPU measures the average revenue for an individual user over all paying users of the service or product. And Joe already touched upon the pros and cons of microtransactions, so I'll just go ahead and touch on the pros and cons of subscriptions. For subscriptions, they can better predict revenue just because you know there's going to be a constant flow on the cash flow, since people are signing up on a certain basis, like I said before, monthly, 6 months, or yearly. And they have greater customer retention, the higher ACLV than non-subscriptions, and there's more potential for upselling and cross-selling. The cons are they can be annoying for customers if the payment process isn't automated, and that requires more customer interaction. A lot of people just kind of want things to go smoothly and be involved as little on the payment side as possible. And there's a greater loss of revenue due to people buying larger amounts of content. And that's usually amongst people that are more into gaming and do it more regularly. And overall, subscriptions were proven to be a better option than microtransactions, and that was because there's more options of subscriptions, which is frequent subscriptions, infrequent subscriptions, and premium subscriptions. And the buy-in for microtransaction models, it is higher, but due to lower customer costs, the regular revenue potential for subscriptions model is more stable, and that's again because subscriptions are more likely to generate a constant inflow of cash as opposed to a microtransaction where they're paid whenever. It's more on your own basis, not because you have to. And microtransactions are more financially risky, and subscriptions are more easily measurable. And the SEC and the IFRS both have their own types guidance and regulations for microtransactions. So for the SEC, microtransaction revenues come from the sale of virtual goods and currencies to players in an attempt to better their gameplay experience. And they're initially recorded as deferred revenues, and then the revenues are recognized as the player uses the virtual goods and their purchase with the virtual currency. So the two categories the SEC recognizes for virtual goods are consumable and durable goods. Consumable virtual goods are goods that can be consumed by the actions of a certain player, and the revenues are recognized as goods are consumed. And the durable virtual goods are goods that are made available to the player over an extended period of time, and those revenues are recognized ratably over the period of time the goods are accessible to the player, which is generally the estimated service period of the game.
So this is the end of our part of the presentation. We're going to have video recorded in only respective part. Again, I just want to emphasize a thank you just for the great semester. I'm sure Rory and Bernadette feel the same way. So without any further ado, Vinny, take it away.
Hello everyone. If you reached this part of the video, we're now going to talk about IFRS guidance for microtransactions. So when firms deal with microtransactions, they mostly refer to the standards put forth in IFRS 15, which discusses the principles related to revenue recognition from contracts with customers. Now, IFRS 15, they put 5 steps in to determine revenue recognition. These 5 steps are: identify the contracts with the customer, identify the performance obligations in the contract. Performance obligations are the promises in the contract to transfer a good to a customer, a good or service to a customer. Determine the transaction price. Allocate the transaction price to each performance obligation on the basis of relative standalone selling prices of each distinct good or service promised in the contract. The 5th step is recognize revenue when the performance obligation is satisfied by transferring a promised good or service to a customer. Now, when dealing with microtransactions, the first 4 steps seem pretty basic. Identify the contract with the customer, which is whatever virtual good is being sold to the customer. Identify the performance obligations in the contract. So I guess it's the promise of receiving the virtual good after paying for however much of that good, if it's a virtual currency thing or if it's an actual virtual good for a game. Determine the transaction price, which would be listed on an app. Allocate the transaction price to each performance obligation of the basis of relative standalone selling prices of each distinct goods or service promised in the contract. So that step and the recognized revenue when the performance obligation is satisfied, that step is what's mostly a concern, not a concern, is the basis of discussion when dealing with virtual goods. So the performance obligation is satisfied based on guidance from SAB topic 13A, which you can find in the codification 605-10-S99-1. So this codification states that revenue shall not be recognized until persuasive evidence of an arrangement exists, delivery has occurred, or services have been rendered. Now, the delivery portion is basically what's the basis for these recognitions for the microtransactions. Described in slide 10, we put down the types of deliveries when talking about microtransactions, on how there's 3 different types. So there's the life of the virtual good, the life of the gamer, and the life of the game. These are the recognition preferences that firms use to recognize when revenue is recognized. Let me just scroll back. So the delivery portion varies on the type of virtual good bought. If virtual good is virtual currency, revenue not recognized until that currency is used for actual good delivered. If deliverable good is the virtual good, revenue recognized when player receives it in inventory. Just a basic example, the game Fortnite, they have virtual currency called V-Bucks. When people buy V-Bucks, for example, $10 is worth 1,000 V-Bucks, they can rack in however many V-Bucks that they want, and they could purchase virtual goods like skins, backpacks they could use, and some emotes that they have for sale. And those are worth a certain amount of V-Bucks, not a certain amount of actual currency, US currency. So the revenue for them, for Epic Games, the creator of Fortnite, it's not recognized until the V-Bucks are used. So if someone buys something worth 1,000 V-Bucks, that's when they recognize the revenue of the $10 bought by that person. For the rest of the IFRS guidance, for the rest of the codification, the other steps are the seller's price to the buyer is fixed and determinable, which we discussed before, and collectability is reasonably assured. So that concludes the IFRS guidance for microtransactions and the specific codification when dealing with them that firms use. And on to the next slide.